Hello everyone and welcome to my studio. Today I'd like to show you how to paint this beautiful doorway surrounded by pink bougainvillea. I'm using a Rembrandt 24 color watercolor set and a number 6 travel brush. I'm using a 9" by 12" Rembrandt watercolor sketchbook with 90-pound paper, and this is a lead holder. You can see how the lead can retract into the device so that it doesn't get all over the inside of your bag, and a white plastic eraser. If you need to sharpen the point, you can use this point sharpener. You can use an ink pen. You can use a TWSBI pen, which is what I draw with, and this D Atramentis ink, or you can use the disposable Staedtler or Micron pens .05. I like to use these Posca white bullet tip pens too. I don't use it in today's video, but they're handy to have. I'm holding my lead holder between my thumb and my middle finger, and I'm drawing with the side of the pencil. And I'm drawing with pencil first, and afterwards my plan is to draw ink over the pencil lines and then erase all the pencil lines with the white plastic eraser before I begin painting. You don't have to draw your drawing in pencil first, but it is helpful when you're doing architecture because it's so easy to make mistakes. And even though mistakes that you make in pen oftentimes add charm and character to your drawing, it's just helpful sometimes to do a light pencil sketch first and at least find your boundaries. You can always add in more details later with the pen. So I started with the big clumpy shapes of the bougainvillea, and then I'm just finding the tops and sides of the door and drawing a few of the architectural details. This is going to be a pretty simple, colorful sketch, and there isn't too much perspective because it's a straight-on view of this door. Now I've sped up the last bit of this drawing section of this video. When I make roof lines, I often make them swing out a little bit, and then I'll add sort of a dark little accent, sometimes where lines meet, such as where the door at the bottom meets the step. You can see there's little dark areas there. And I sometimes make darker lines at the base of something, such as the base of the steps. I drew the stones in very loosely, and I drew them in a way that makes them look like they're sort of fanning out from the door out towards the bottom right and left corners of the paper. Don't worry about getting the door too perfect. Try to get the lines of the details of the squares and rectangles to line up, but they don't have to be perfectly shaped or perfectly drawn. Again, this is a sketch, and that's really kind of a fun style and a fun approach to sketching, is to not be so perfect and so hard on yourself. You want to capture the essence of this scene. And what it's all about is the colorful flowers and the colorful door and the light and shadow. Now it's time to do the ink. So as I said, I'm going to draw my ink lines right over the pencil lines, and then after I finish with the ink, I'm going to erase all the pencil before I draw. And I like to do this because the pencil leaves sort of a gray film on the paper, and it just takes away from the colorfulness of it, and it also lessens the bright white paper. So I want bright white paper and bright colors, and in order to get that result, I need to erase all the pencil lines. So I'm going over the drawing very carefully, and as I draw with a pen, I often push and lift, and I leave little breaks. Do you see the little breaks I'm leaving around the stones? Not each circle is complete. So I draw little lines, and I leave just little breaks in between. And I try to leave a lot of white space and keep my drawings pretty loose. I don't do much cross-hatching. Some sketchers do, but I like to leave all of the shadows and details to paint more than to pen. So that's just a matter of personal taste, and you'll decide what's right for you. So when I'm drawing architecture, I try to draw with straight lines, but not always continuous lines. So I'll draw a line, and then I'll lift the pen and draw another section of it. And I do try to take my time when I'm using my pen, because it's hard to paint over mistakes that you make with a permanent ink pen. It's not impossible, but these are lines that cannot be erased. So in between the door, the two sides of the door, I'm drawing a double line. And I do that sometimes as a reminder to myself that this is going to be something that's going to be a dark accent. And I'm going to do another double line here at the top of the door. When I draw with a pencil, I showed you how I like to hold it between my thumb and my middle finger and draw with the side of the pencil. But when I draw with a pen, I want the pen to be more perpendicular to the paper, not to the side. And this is an F nib, so it's a fine point, and it just needs to be perpendicular to the paper in order to get a clean line. If the pen is slanted too much, then I'll get a broken line. You see how I just sort of make quick straight lines? Make a line and lift, make a line and lift. Once you start drawing with a pen, it'll become more and more comfortable to do. I've sped up the last section of my ink drawing. I'm just filling in the rest of the details around the door, and I'm going to draw over the clumps of Bougainvillea. I love how this Bougainvillea towers over the door and the organic lines of the Bougainvillea flowers in contrast to the straight lines around the door. It's a wonderful combination of shapes and lines, perfect for sketching. Now it's time to start painting. I'm using my number 6 Silverbrush Voyage travel brush. Number 6 is the perfect size for sketching. I'm going to start with permanent red violet, which is the same as primary magenta, depending on which colors or brand of colors you're using. I'm using this color all by itself to begin with. I'm using a fairly good amount of water, but not too much. In watercolor, the more water you use, the lighter your paint will be, and you don't want to ever add white to the color unless you want it to be opaque, but you want to lighten your colors with water. I'm making small brush strokes, leaving bits of white in between on purpose. This is a way to let the paper sort of glow through, and it also just gives the painting a certain amount of sparkle. So I'm filling in all the areas where I see Bougainvillea in the sun. Now the lighter areas are complete, and it's time to make the shadowy parts of the Bougainvillea. So I'm using mauve, which is similar to dioxazine purple, and I'm also using some ultramarine blue, and I'm going to mix in some Madder Lake Deep. Madder Lake Deep is similar to alizarin crimson. And wherever I see some shadowy areas on the Bougainvillea in the reference photo, I'm just adding these colors. And I'm not using too much water, I'm using less water with this darker color. My marks that I'm making are smaller, but they're in the same style of just small little marks and leaving bits of white. And I'm coming into the underside of some of the areas of pink. So you'll notice that some of the darks I'm applying are just Madder Lake Deep, and they're a warmer red, more of a burgundy red, and then some of the other areas are darker and more towards purple. I wanted to have some variety of colors in my darks, and I wanted to have that vibration that you get in paintings when you have warmer and cooler colors next to each other. Later, I'm going to go back over the light pink Bougainvillea and add some warmth with some cadmium red. Now that I've completed the pink, I'm going to add green. I'm starting with cadmium yellow and permanent green. This is a nice, bright, fresh, pretty green. I'm also going to add gamboge. Gamboge is a very light, clear, transparent yellow, and it's a more organic looking color, a more natural looking yellow than cadmium yellow, and it makes beautiful greens where there's sun hitting the leaves. I'm being very careful not to touch the edges of the pink and leaving white spaces in between the greens, the same sort of technique that I used to paint the pink bougainvillea flowers. I'm going to add dark greens too, and for the dark greens I'm going to use Hooker's Green Deep and some sap green, and also a little bit of ultramarine blue. I'm mixing some burnt sienna and yellow ochre in with the greens. It helps create balance, so it's not just pink and green, but you have some natural looking colors in there as well. Going in with the darker greens now, I'm going into the underside of the yellowish greens and also into the white area of the paper. I just want to create a nice look of light and shadow with the green leaves. Now I'm going to paint the bougainvillea branches with burnt sienna and mauve. Not too much is showing, but it does add some nice structure to the bougainvillea. Now I'm adding some cadmium red and water to the pink bougainvillea where it's very light, just to give a little extra added warmth. So now my green leaves and my bougainvillea have a nice balance of warm and cool. I'm going to paint the building where it's orange using cadmium orange and yellow ochre. I'm using the side of my brush and making pretty broad strokes, and I'm leaving little bits of white showing. Now it's time to paint the stones. I'm going to mix cobalt blue and permanent red violet and a little bit of yellow ochre to make a nice 3-color gray. I'm going to vary the amount of blue, yellow, and red as I paint each of the stones so that they're all a little bit different. I'm leaving white space around the stones, which later I'm going to glaze over with a reddish brown, and also some shadowing that's being cast from the bougainvillea onto the street. To harmonize the street with the house, I'm adding some yellow ochre in between the stones. I'm still going to glaze over them later with some red and some shadow colors, but I'm putting this down first. Leaving lots of white, but just to fill in a little bit in between the gray. This nice warmth looks very pretty. It doesn't look like that in the photograph, but it makes for a nice strong foreground in my sketch. Now it's time to paint the door. I'm going to begin with a mixture of cobalt blue and cerulean blue. If you don't have cobalt, you can use ultramarine. I'm also adding a very tiny amount of mauve. I'm putting this color on fairly lightly because I'm going to come back over it when it's dry with a darker color for the cast shadow. The door in the picture is sort of a gray blue, but I've made it a little bit more bright and colorful. That's just the style that I like to paint in, and you don't have to make it this bright. If you want to make it a gray or blue, you need to add some of the blue's complement, which is orange. When you want to gray down a color, the more gray you want it to be, the more of the complementary color you need to add. The less gray you want it to be, the less of that color you need to add. So if you wanted to make it just slightly gray or blue, you would add a tiny amount of orange. And if you wanted to make it a really gray color, you'd mix almost 50% orange and 50% blue. You'll notice I'm filling in the door little bits at a time, small brush strokes, and still leaving lots of white. And I'm making sure that my paint application is not perfectly even. I want to have some dark areas of color and some lighter areas of color. One of the things that I love about watercolor is the imperfectness of it, how the medium has a mind of its own, and so I just kind of go with that when I paint with watercolor. I just make marks, and some are lighter and some are darker, and I work with it. And once you become comfortable with watercolor, you'll find that it's really a lot of fun to just sort of play with it and play with the colors. I'm adding extra color to this brown section on the right just because I like to watch the colors run together. It's just a really nice part of working with this medium. It's very spontaneous. Now it's time to add the shadows. I've mixed ultramarine blue and permanent red violet to make a nice bright, pretty purple. So I'm looking at the reference photo, and wherever I see shadows cast in a nice angle, I'm just painting them, and I'm not letting the shadow necessarily connect with the flowers or whatever is casting the shadows. You can see I'm leaving a little bit of space in between, and I'm even leaving white spaces in the shadow where I know there isn't white, but it's just a style that I like to paint in, and you can choose to do this or not, but I definitely recommend trying it because you can always go back and put more color in, but you can't put white back when you've taken it away. Notice how beautiful this part of the painting is. I have the movement of the blue streaks going up and down the door, and now I'm painting across that with this violet shadow color, and I'm leaving little flecks of not white but the blue color showing through, and I'm also putting some extra shadowing on the sides around the door, glazing it over the warm brown. It's really a fun process to put the shadow over the door. Now I've mixed mauve and ultramarine blue, and I'm going to make some dark accents at the base of the door, underneath the bougainvillea, and any other places where I think it needs a little extra dark to emphasize the areas in shadow and give it some definition. When I make dark lines, accent lines with my brush, I make them very carefully, and I make a lot of them broken, so I'll put the paint down and lift my brush and make another stroke and lift my brush. It just has a nicer look than if the line is continuous. It looks more painterly. Now that I have my dark accents, I want to add some color accents. So I added cadmium orange and some cadmium red to the sides of the door where it's yellow. But I didn't paint the whole thing, I just made a few accent marks. I glazed a little bit of cadmium red on the stones below, and to complement the orange accents, now I'm adding some bright blue accents to the door. I'm adding these accents in kind of a random way, some dots and some strokes of paint, but it's just bright cobalt blue. I'm adding some gamboge to the door handles to make them look gold. And a little extra touch of burnt sienna to make the gold look shiny. I'm going to define the step a little bit more, making the face of it in a deeper shadow color, and I'm going to put some extra shadow on the left hand side of the upper part of the step. This is ultramarine blue and mauve. The final touch is I'm going to add a few more accents to the Bougainvillea using permanent red violet and not very much water. I want the paint to be really bright, and I'm filling in a few of the white spaces that I left. This is why it's better to leave the white spaces. You can always fill them in later if you want to. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching.